Hi everyone, today's exercises still focus on grayscale and grayscale mixing. We're gonna have the option today of working representationally, so with an object, or abstractly, so maybe thinking about shape, texture, form, using kind of cut paper, collage, and grayscale that you've done in earlier exercises. I'm also going to take a moment and go through the color wheel, look at color bias and complements, and kind of revisit. So for many of you, mixing with complements is something that you've done many times. Some of you, it might be new. But I want to revisit that and talk about it from my perspective and how you can look at the color wheel and then look at actual paint and see how that contributes to grayscale mixing, how you can make warm grays, cool grays, so on and so forth. So there'll be a little bit of a talk first about the color wheel. I'm going to pull up some paint charts because I always save those when I go buy paint myself. And then we'll move to the supplies and the overhead angle, and then of course get to painting. Okay, so bear with me. We'll talk a little bit about the color wheel and then we'll move on to the painting portion of this tutorial. So what I have in front of me here are my very used, as you can see they're flopping around, my very used color wheels that are a staple in my studio. So I have a few, they're from Blick, that's where I bought them. And I've had them for many years. I usually have a stack, some small, some large. And it's not exactly what you buy out of the tube, okay? So this is computer printed and it's not entirely realistic when it comes to what it is, what's gonna actually happen when you're painting, but it gives you a framework and it can be very helpful when you're trying to think of some quick, let's say palettes, or you're struggling maybe with why your pinks aren't looking correct, or why you just can't get your blue light enough or your violet, why things are getting, it kind of sometimes gives you some guidance as far as color harmony is concerned, and then how dark or light a color should be. So on one side, it always has a lot of information here. So if you have a color wheel of your own, please look at it, read some of what's going on in the middle and the side, because it gives you a ton of information. And sometimes we just grab these and go, oh, look, it's all the different colors you can have. And we just maybe, look at the, let's say, tinting or something like that, but we don't really read everything that's going on here. So on the color wheel itself, it always does go through tint, tone, and shade, okay? Again, when you're mixing with your paints, this is gonna be a little bit different. It's not exactly what they have here, but it gives you kind of a framework. The key thing on this side of the color wheel is this complement wheel that I call it, and it gives you a few different examples of complements that you can use in compositions. Or just palette setups, where color harmonies lie. Straight across here is the direct complements. And I always say with complements, they're best friends and worst enemies. When they're side by side, they bring each other out the most. When they're mixed together, they cancel each other, okay? So best of times, worst of times. Those are what complements are. And they're always across from each other on the color wheel. Again, like I said, your actual paint out of the tube is not necessarily what you have here. So the way that's best to think about it is when you have paint on your palette, what leans blue-violet? What leans, let's say, turquoise blue or something like that? What's green? What's all in the green category? What's more of in a yellow-green category? So on and so forth, right? So you kind of have to look at things categorically because they're not gonna match up with your color wheel exactly. And that's gonna help you pick from your palette what kind of complements you need, either to make colors stand out or to mix together to create your grays. And there's a myriad of grays that you can create, okay? There's not just one gray that works. Also, inside of the color wheel are all these different harmonies and relationships. So there's split complements. I tend to use these a lot in my work. There is a triad, that's a triangulation that kind of works a lot like if you do red, blue, yellow, that is a triad, but there's other triads that kind of read like a primary, primary composition, let's say, but they're not primaries. So if I took it to blue, violet, and then red, orange, and then yellow, green, it's reading like a red, blue, yellow, but it's not as basic as a red, blue, yellow, okay? So those are some things to think about as well. When you get to these different tetrads, those are a little more, sometimes that might be too much going on. I don't tend to use tetrads as much myself. I tend to go with the triangulation and an accent color. Okay, but for today, we're gonna be really thinking about complements and where we find them, okay? On the back side of the color wheel, again, this relates to, since we've been talking about value, you see that you have the hues, okay? And then you have this value scale that's on the inside. And sometimes I have students that are like, oh, well, this is interesting. This is just so I know my, let's say, 10-point value scale, so on and so forth. Not really sure what this is for. Well, it's actually to line up value to color. So as you can see, if I take the value scale and I line up some of the darker values with violet, you can see that there's a match there. This is really key when it comes to blue-greens, when it comes to, on the other side, reds, like understanding that these colors actually sit in the middle right out of the tube. And that can really help you if you're working with midtones. You need something in the middle. Again, we're gonna be working with color eventually. So I want you to think about value in terms of color. And as you're working in black and white, think about naming, like what color actually sits in that zone? What color sits in this zone, right? We all know that yellow is gonna sit in that white area, right? So we know that our yellows, whatever we use, are always gonna kind of mix in that highlight. There's gonna give you that sunlight or the spark or the shine, that sort of thing, okay? So that's kind of known. It also shows you that if you're trying to make blue, violet, white, you've got a long way to go. That's a lot of white to add, right? So that's something to take into consideration as well. On the inside, it has this fun little exercise where you see if you add different kinds of colors, right? So yellow to green makes yellow green, that sort of thing. But if you add yellow to violet, what does that create, right? So that makes kind of a brownish color. So maybe you need something along those lines, and this is gonna help you figure that out, okay? That's just a little mini tour of the color wheel. There's always definitions written on there as well. I highly recommend that you grab one of these. What I wanted to do in contrast is actually, so this is my Novacolor chart. These are a very highly pigmented acrylic paint that you can buy in Culver City. So they're produced here in Los Angeles. Again, some of you are working in watercolor, some of you are working in gouache or acrylic or oils, okay? But these charts apply to any paint that you buy, okay? I just happen to have the Novacolor one in my hand right now. And what this does, I strongly recommend when you go buy a series of paint that you grab one of these, right? So you can get an idea of what that company is and what they make. It can seem overwhelming at first, but then you start to realize, oh look, if I want a warm yellow, right? Then I have about 3 that I can choose from. And it looks from this chart that like, if I kind of want to orange lean it a little bit, then I've got a little range there. These are a little bit cooler on this side, okay? And I can buy a range of those because according to this chart, they're kind of similar. So you might be bored with cadmium yellow light and you decided, yeah, I want some bismuth. Let's see what that does. There's a very small variation, but you can see when it comes to your mixing strategies, it's not gonna change your mixing strategies that much, right? It's not that different of a color, right? So you can feel better experimenting if you get the chart and playing around with color a little bit, if you look at this and see what's close to what you want. For example, I paint a lot of pools. I like pools in my landscapes and things like that. Sorry, I cut myself today. It's not like I keep my Band-Aid out of it. But right here, and I have to actually buy these turquoises to get that really shiny pool-like water. I can't get it from that. You can see right here, no matter what I end up mixing that with, it's not gonna look like that. That's a natural, that's something that the company makes, and it has that real kind of fake blue look. Okay, it's something that I need for a composition. Again, fluorescents, where are you gonna get those, okay? So I keep these charts around. These charts are really important and they can help you mix better, they can help you expand your palette, they can help you get the look of things that you want more, okay? So I'm a strong advocate of just picking these up, okay? Again, when we're talking about complement mixing, so you gotta look and say, okay, here we go, I've got blues here, okay, and I've got a range of oranges here. we know that blue and orange kind of cancel each other out. But all of these different blues are gonna give you a bit of a different result depending on what orange you put in there, okay? And on top of that, you've also got earth tones, as you can see. I'm gonna put that up close, that lean either red or orange, okay? And you can get a range of grays there. There's just a lot that you can do, okay? So I'm gonna show you a few different options today. I'm gonna show you how I approach gray mixing and how I can get kind of a range. So it's just not black and white or black out and white. You know, that's your basic. If you need something very neutral, you can go ahead and do that. But if you want to be more creative and you want your base palette to, you know, sometimes I'm thinking of a certain accent color. Like, for example, if I'm gonna go, let's say the cadmium orange deep is an accent that I'm using, right? Well, I'm gonna build my grays out of these range of blues with some of that orange in there. So everything kind of relates. It feels harmonious in the end. So a lot of times I do take this into consideration so that everything in the palette, nothing feels disjointed. It feels harmonious. It feels like the accent was built out of all the other colors that were there, okay? And again, this goes for both representational work and abstract work, right? I say this often, but all painting is abstract, right? So that feeling, if you have someone, sometimes you have someone looking at objects, but you want them to engage with that. So you need to have your color harmonies engaged or your color harmonies working so that everybody looks at everything, the objects that you have in the piece. Same thing goes for abstraction. Good abstraction is going to have this lovely like symphony of color going on, right? That isn't gonna engage the viewer. If it's disjointed, then people are gonna kind of go in quick and then walk away and not really get the feeling of your piece, okay? Again, you can make disjointed color if the whole thing is to kind of jar the audience. That does make sense. But also that comes from knowing what rules you're breaking. So regardless of what your outcome is, good color theory, in my opinion, and that again stems from grayscale mixing, right? So we understand the grayscale well, that means we're gonna understand color well. That is the foundations of painting, in my opinion, okay? And again, why I spend a good amount of time on it and how we build color from neutrals so that you can become the best in your painting. Okay, so I'm gonna go over to the station. We're gonna go look at all the materials and what it is we're working on today. Again, if you're in watercolor, there'll be certain paint and surfaces that I'm working with you on. If you're in oil and acrylic, again, show you those supports and that base. I won't talk much about abstraction, to be honest, because there's photos of that in your assignment prompts. Just know that you have the option of working kind of tearing up your old exercises, working paint on paper, things like that, and then kind of thinking about mark making value form, okay? For this tutorial, it is gonna focus a lot more on the object. So basically, I have a mug and I have the mug on a white background, and it's also going to focus on how I get to the grays that I use for the painting. Okay, see you soon at the painting station. Okay, so we've got our setup. I am going to first talk about supplies, what I've got laid out here, and then get into a little bit of that gray mixing with watercolor. So I have my water, of course my big water container here, a range of brushes, and I most likely am gonna be using some of the larger, some of the wash brushes, maybe not that big, but something along those lines, you know, kind of laying it out with some nice wet on wet, and then bleeding, you know, some of my values into that as well. I'm actually using my Stay Wet. I have a tiny little Stay Wet acrylic palette. It's got a wet sponge underneath and then some nice, this keeps the paper moist. Again, this is designed for acrylic, but I've found that it works for watercolor painting as well and doesn't confine you to the wells as much. I did get the paint laid out, so what I'm gonna talk about today or use today, I've kind of got some examples here. So again, with grayscale, we can always use just that neutral black and white. Where I guided you with the exercises was in that direction. Okay, so I've got that lunar black out, and then I'm using some Chinese white here, very nice clean white. I got a new tube of that. Okay, and that's always going to give you that real super middle of the road, neutral, black and white. Okay, doesn't really have any temperature. It's just very standard. Put a little bit more in. We've got one watercolor paint that's very gummy. And I've got one watercolor paint that's not so gummy. That's a lot fresher because I just bought it. Okay. Okay, so you can see that's a nice, I'm on the darker end here, but that's a nice gray that I'm getting. Okay, let me go ahead and grab a brush. It's one of my just kind of, it's not necessarily a flat brush, it's a little bit round, more of a filbert style brush. Okay, I'm actually, my still life is going to be here, or my object is going to be here, but I will put a little paint on my page so you can see. Okay, so that's that here. Okay, so I'm going to do the still life example or the object example on this page, but I do want to show you, okay, what these are looking like. Okay, now I've got your standard kind of sketching watercolor block. This paper's not the fanciest, let's say, so I do kind of add a little water, let it pool, kind of. Those really nice washes, you're gonna have to get a, you know, a higher grade, but this is fine. Fine for examples. Again, today it's getting a little dark in the studio, so, and again, that's me dabbing. For some of you already do that, but sometimes I pull it, then dab. Gives this kind of stained look, almost like you dripped your coffee. I like doing it that way too. If I put a lot of water in it and then dab, it gives this crisp little edge, which I enjoy. So that's sometimes a technique that I use. So I've got palette, water, again, brushes, and then I'm using my paper towels as my rags today. So Viva paper towels, they're really good as far as feeling like cloth. The last thing I do have here is a 4-inch pencil, of course, my kneaded eraser, and that is what I've used to kind of quickly outline the mug that I'm using as a subject. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ellipses since I do have this as a subject. So that will also be a nice little tutorial on that. Okay. So going back to our grayscale, we can kind of have that standard black and white, and we see on the page what that looks like. But we also have the option of mixing complements. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put out some green. I have a permanent green light. Again, that's very kind of a bright standard green. Okay. If you want a darker value, you can always go for a darker green, but you're going to see this red that I'm using, which is a permanent rose. Okay, is actually going to kind of cancel out that green to a certain degree. So again, red and green are across from each other on the color wheel, and I'm going to go ahead and put some of them into each other. Okay, so remember, complements are best friends and worst enemies. Okay, and what I'm going to get now is a kind of grayish look to this. So the goal is, when you're gray mixing, is not being able to see too much of any one color. Okay, so if this reads really green, then you probably need to put a little more red in. If it reads really red, then you need to put a little more green in. Okay, this, in my particular situation, the red is a bit stronger, so I'm going to use a little more green to cancel it out. And as you can see, the value darkened when I did this. Okay, so that kind of, like I said, the red saturated that green. So I could have used a darker green and I'd get a darker gray, but I'm going to be good with this for now. I'm going to go ahead, and what I do to open up a color is I'll use a little bit of white and I'll move that to the side, and I grab just a tiny bit of my color, and then I see what it looks like when white is added, and that gives me a better representation. If I just look at it here, it's just kind of a dark, muddy thing. But if I go like that, oh, that's kind of red. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more green in there and see what I end up with. Oops, I'm kind of ripping the page slightly. See what happens if I do that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that feels like that's grayish, and it still feels like it has a bit of a temperature to it. Let me go ahead and take this over here. That's my dog saying, "What are you doing?" There you go, and you can see right there. See when I put that on the page? Look at that. That's just kind of basic, but this has a temperature to it. Okay, that's almost kind of a brown look to that. okay? Again, this is very warm, it's very neutral, very warm. If I want it to go back to, or if I want something that's just a little bit on the neutral side, I'm gonna take that mixture here, and I could go ahead and just add a little bit of my black, okay? Or again, use different complements, you know, it's just, you can kind of use a variety. Different paints are going to do different things. If you use blue and orange, you're gonna get a different range there. Again, I have a lot of paints out, so I have yellow. If you take yellow and you mix that with a little bit of violet, okay, this is gonna give you a different kind of gray. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways, and you can lean that more violet, and that's gonna have a certain look to it. And then you can always leave your black here if you just need something that to you reads more like a grayscale. But I would like to challenge a lot of you on this particular painting. Give this gray, or you know, this brownish color, give it a temperature. Have it look cool or warm or something along those lines. Yeah, just for the sake of example, let me just move this to the side real quick because we just got a bunch of grays on the page. I will go ahead and I'm grabbing an imperial purple. It's okay if you don't have that in your kit. Actually, because you're more likely to have ultramarine blue. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab ultramarine blue. This is a great one for gray mixing, okay? And I am going to go for, actually, if you have any kind of orange, a cadmium orange, this is pyrrole orange, okay? That's gonna make a pretty decent gray right there. I'm gonna go ahead and move my blue here, and I'm gonna add some orange right into it like that. See my mixing, and that's pretty decent. That's good. That's another gray with a good amount of temperature to it, okay? It's not gonna read like that. It's very dark. It's darker than this one I have here, but it's not so neutral, right? It has some temperature. I'm gonna mix that there, that to the side. Clean off my brush, okay. And go ahead and let's move that over here. See what we got here. Okay, that's a little bit on the violety side, so I can stand to add some orange to that. Now again, with watercolors, mixing gray or doing this kind of, you know, neutral, you do want to keep your colors, the mixes, limited. Too many mixed colors in the mixture can make a very muddy pigment, okay? That's pretty. And I actually like that against that other mixture that I made. So that neutral that I made, that's really pretty, okay? Again, it could stand to, it's kind of reading, it turned violetish too much, so it can stand to have a baby bit more blue in the mixture. Noticing that. Let's just see what happens when I put a little more blue. Yeah, gives it more of a gray feel. Again, my white is kind of to the side. Let's see. Kind of add the grayish, add the white to that and kind of bleed it out. Let's see what we get here. Yeah, that's kind of nice, okay? So again, it's up to you, but do try to make some sort of temperature, okay, to the neutral mix that you're using. So this is just your basic white with black. These are kind of these neutral mixes, grayish, brownish, things like that, okay? Mixing complements. So you're getting warm or you're getting cool, and this gives you some control, okay? It's not a fully saturated look. It's got this kind of tonal look to it, okay? But it also gives you a lot of control, okay? So I can move it more towards the violet side, which you see is warmer here, but then I can put a little more blue in, and I'm moving it to the blue side, still kind of grayish or toned down, okay? But it has temperature. This does not, this does. You can also use a combo. So you can take this very neutral look, and then you can add shots of color in there, and that's really gonna accent that, or a color wash on top, let's say. Okay, I'm gonna just kind of do, it's like a little scratch pad here. Okay, like a little colored wash, and then that kind of goes over the gray. So these are some fun things that you can do with color. Let's go over to the cup, and I'll put that as an inlay for this video. At the top of the mug or the cup, You have to make sure your ellipse at the top or the mouth of the subject is pretty flat because we're not looking into it. I was looking directly on, okay? So it doesn't matter what you set up where you're at. Try to do something that maybe is round or has an ellipse so you can practice with that. The other thing when I'm dealing with round objects or ellipses is I do that vertical line, okay, to show balance. Again, I'll do it, kind of watch my motion. It's gonna be a little light on the camera, but just watch my motion, okay? Again, I'm using a light pencil. And then I do curve the ellipse more at the bottom. See how I'm doing that there? Okay, and then bring it down on both sides for symmetry, okay? This is kind of like doing a portrait, like the ear, bring it around and down, how it hooks with the mug there. Okay, I'm not trying to get my lines too dark because I don't want to mess with my composition, but there's that. And then there's the horizon line back here and back here. Okay, so for this, I'm just gonna kind of do a first pass bleed with some washes, okay? And then it will have to dry, and then this is something that you would come back into later and work on at a later date, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna use my round brush, which kind of puts a good amount of pigment on. And then I'm gonna use the flat brush to kind of push the paint where I want it to go, okay? You can also kind of wet the page. In my situation, there's a lot of values in this composition that are very similar, so I can let the edges bleed together. But I do have these areas of highlight. I probably should take out my pencil now, or erase those pencil marks now, so I can kind of use a crisp edge. Go ahead and kind of make it crisp here, so I can leave and reserve the white of the page to let that bleed happen, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and use, which gray am I gonna use? Probably this one. I really liked that is the red and green. More, oop, well, that's not fun. Oop. Here, let me start over. Okay, let's do that again. So we're gonna move that to the side. That's a scratch page. That can turn into a collage. I don't wanna do that. Okay, so let me go again. I'll draw one more time my mug. Flat ellipse at the top. Let's do a vertical line going down. Make it more dramatic at the bottom. Okay, that's how the ellipses work. Again, this I can kind of even do without a source. I mean, you can kind of play like the sphere. You know, you can look at a ball, but you don't really have to. They're kind of standard. Horizon line here, horizon line here. Again, the mouth is shorter to the eye line, and this is out. Again, when you're sight measuring, how wide is it to how tall it is? That's something that you want to do. For mine, it's about the width and the height are about the same with a little extra at the bottom, okay? Move this to the side, and that's the handle there. Again, it kind of curves up a little bit here and is flatter right there where the horizon would be. Okay, again, I'm gonna go back in and probably put my water to that side because that's my problem, right? Okay, again, I'm using that kind of, it's more brown than it is gray, but this is a green and red mixture. Again, kind of go back to, and like I said, let's wet this a little bit. This is my nice brush. Okay, I'm gonna wet this softly, but leave room for that lip. Use that, reserve that for the white of the page, okay? And like I said, the background and the foreground of this mug, in my particular situation, are kind of similar. Okay. Again, this handle, I'm gonna reserve the white of the page there too. Okay. Put this down. Now this is lighter down here, but I can kind of put a wash in, that will be fine. Okay. Put wet in the back, and I'm actually just gonna paint into this now. Okay. Now in this situation, let's go ahead, let's add a little blue to that because I should probably cool that down in the back. And we're working really with neutrals. Oh, there we go. That's a pretty one. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Okay. Give a nice little bleed kind of work fun there. And I am actually gonna go in here. It's gonna be a little darker. And I'm working with a very loose brush here, but sometimes it's just good for your technique. Yourself. There we go. That's kind of fun, right? Good days and bad days. That's a good day when you get your edge nice like that. I do like to challenge myself to use larger brushes to see how it's just kind of a zen moment, see how we can really work with brush control. Loving this bleed here. Again, that's the fun thing with watercolor. Definitely have fun with it. That you can use the washes, you can use the bleeds to your advantage. And like I said, there's values in the back and values in the front that are very similar for my composition. So I'm gonna kind of let that happen. And then, because I have a base, I'm gonna use a tighter brush. Just grab something flatter. What do we got here? Looks to me like I have one designer watercolor brush and the rest have room to be desired. They're not designer, but have room to be desired. While it's wet, and remember I have wet on wet, so the page is a little wet as well, I'm definitely bleeding this down because, what was I gonna say? That's kind of a smooth look there. Okay. Go ahead down here. I also do need to get into here, but that goes together. So I'm trying to work as quickly as possible so I can get some of these background values. Move through that. Watercolor, you don't layer as much. It's kind of edge to edge. Oil painting and acrylic, for any of you who do that, you do kind of layer. With this, not so much. But you do still kind of want to layer a baby bit, and you want to also use the wet of the page. Okay. So I'm going to work quickly through here. This is my softer, bigger brush. Okay, I'm working again. These are some darker values. Add some blue into my red and green mixture. Okay, go back here as well. I was gonna have a darker edge here and there's gonna be some darker there. But see, I can let this be warmer in the front because this is the stuff that moves forward, okay? So I can change up. That's kind of nice also about the grayscale mixing is I can change up the temperature, okay? So we're getting a sense of space in that sense. And that's the shadow there, okay? I'm gonna add a little bit of the blue mix to that. I'm still kind of putting it back into my neutral, okay? There we go. Kind of nice. That, I do have to be careful here. That edge is not as harsh as I've made it, so let's just kind of bleed that in. Again, work quickly. You wanna make sure that you're seeing where the blind spots are. If you want it to dry with a harder edge, I want the shadow to dry with a harder edge, so I'm gonna leave that. And that one's a little bit too wet there, but I'm gonna kind of go back in here, okay? The last thing I'm gonna do for this particular pass, because I'll have to let it sit and then I can go clean it up and I can go in and, you know, make edges more crisp where I want them. You can use white if I need to have some opaque additions. Is I'm actually gonna go in now and with the darkest, kind of almost mid-dark, still very soft because this is a white on white object, but I'm gonna go in with some of those before we just get too dry here. And that's gonna help bring out some definition for me. Okay, so there was like a bit of a shadow in the candle. There. There's this in the back. Again, I'm trying my best to really keep those edges clean and reserve those whites as much as I possibly can because it's just such a nice thing to be able to do. Okay, and bleed that in. Just a tiny bit of layering there. And then I am gonna go ahead, I does need to be a value down here. These are not reserved, so we gotta kind of put a wash in here. Let's see where that goes, okay? Down at the bottom, can clean that up a little bit later. let that bleed somewhat. And then go ahead down here. And actually I'm gonna pull that up slightly. Okay, again, when it's wet on wet like this, you still have some room. You can kind of get that towel in there, move it, you have the ability to kind of play with the surface somewhat. You can use some of these bleeds to your advantage. It adds to the, the feeling of the piece. The main thing, like I said, at this stage is just to make sure that you're reserving, if you really want something to be bright and white and you don't want to be bound to adding, let's say, adding opacity to everything. If you really want to reserve that area, then you do be careful, think about your edges as you're creating these spaces, okay? Because that's really gonna make or break that situation. So again, I'm gonna go back in here, get a little bit more definition to the edge of that handle. So when I come back in to kind of pass through, I have to have a little dab, might have to add some opacity to even that out there, but my highlight's really working. So I can go ahead and kind of work on the surface later on and just put some nice brush strokes here as it dries and kind of change the feeling, the texture, give myself a little bit of that. So it's a pretty decent first pass, and that gives me some stuff to work with. Okay, as I come back over the surface. Okay, and again, for anything that's highlights, something along those lines, you're gonna have to come back in later, so it will really sit on the surface there. Okay, so you can kind of get an idea. That's like a first, second pass, really laying out your subject, thinking about your drawing, thinking about temperature in grays rather than just using that basic neutral black and white, okay? And you can see here, it's still gray, but has more nuance to it and creates, like you can see if I put a pop of violet in here later, or if I do some little additions as I move through the piece, this could become really nice. And it's still gonna read black and white, it's still gonna read as a muted or gray object, but it's gonna have a lot more going on and just kind of be more articulate with color in the end. I want to thank you for joining me in the studio again today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Again, another circle on grayscale and value, but this time we're really thinking about how we mix those grays and how we can even lean them more cool. You can apply this to just painting an object, or you can also even just play around with it abstractly and kind of look at temperature, mood, dark to light, and mark making as well. Okay, have a lovely rest of your painting session if you're painting along with me, and another tutorial will be coming soon.